This is Josh Bycer from GameWisdom.com. Hope you enjoy this Critical Thought, your daily discussion on game design. And be sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and you can pitch future Critical Thought topics. Alright, we got a good Critical Thought for you today. Before we get going, a little bit of an announcement. A friend of mine was kind enough to give me one of his free beta keys for For Honor, which is the upcoming multiplayer title from, I think, Ubisoft. So, the beta runs, I think, in a few days, and when that goes, expect to see some footage here on the channel. For today's Critical Thought, we're going to be talking about one of the biggest killers of video games, especially in the indie and kick-started space. And that is the challenge of designing and building a game at the same time. I know that sounds kind of weird, and hopefully over the next few minutes we'll explain what that's all about. In earlier Critical Thought, I talked about the fact that at its basic foundation, a video game is designed around the aesthetics, the programming, and the mechanics or the game design itself. And a good game typically will have at least two of the three, and we can certainly get into some philosophy here. But the point is, video game design is very much about the philosophy of good game mechanics and systems, as well as being able to actually build that via programming, coding on your engine, or designing your own engine, and so on. And what that means is, as we've talked about, video games are both an entertainment and a product. And when these two forces come together as you're trying to build a game, it can lead to a lot of trouble. And as I just said a few seconds ago, it's one of the common things we see as a killer of games, especially in the early access, crowdfunding, and indie space. And I know that, again, that doesn't really make sense just on first listen. So let's talk a little bit more about this. One of the biggest challenges of design games, especially those that are unique, is figuring out how all the elements are going to go together while building your engine or building your code that will hopefully run everything. Again, in our heads, everything works perfectly, there are no bugs, all your systems are fine, everyone's going to love it. But as anyone who has looked at code or is a programmer, you know that is most certainly not the case. And when we look at games that are, especially those that are unique or feature never before seen mechanics or design, this magnifies in terms of difficulty. Last year I spoke with Adrian from Abbey Games, who did one of my favorite games, Renowned Explorers International Society. And when we spoke on that podcast, he talked about how hellish it was building the game, because they had to design the custom engine to run everything while they're still trying to figure out what the systems are going to be, how the game's going to work, and stuff like that. And again, the problem is everything works perfectly in your head, but when you start putting stuff to code, the challenge just gets a lot higher, and in some cases, this can lead to all kinds of issues. One of the things that we've seen over the last few years, especially for first-time developers, is the fact that they may get 35-50% done the game and realize, uh-oh, these mechanics aren't working. Or maybe the game just simply isn't fun, no one's enjoying it. Now what do you do? Well, we have to redesign our mechanics. That means more time. But wait, we designed all our mechanics, but now our engine doesn't work with it. Now we gotta program and alter that. But now what happens if we do all that, and now the mechanics still don't work? Now the game gets pushed back more and more and more. And this also goes back to our discussion on project management. Again, we can sit here and say, I will design this game with $500,000 in 18 months and it will be out perfectly then. Of course, as anyone who's done software development or game development knows, most likely that's not the case. You can make all the plans in the world. You can have a perfectly itemized list of stretch goals and systems you want to do for your game, but once you start developing them, you have no idea how that's all going to work and if it's going to work. And there have been examples of this, especially in the indie space over the last few years. A big one would be Planetary Annihilation. One of the first games I kickstarted, I think, was number 2 after the Double Fine Kickstarter. And they had a very successful Kickstarter. I think in terms of game design or game development at that time, it was one of the most successful. They literally hit every stretch goal they had planned. And what happened was the game just did not meet expectations. It certainly attracted a hardcore following to this day, but in terms of being the next macro style RTS for the community, it just didn't live up to expectations. And its 1.0 release was just mired with bugs, missing features, and infamously not even having a save option for the grand campaign. And what happened was it kind of seemed like they overloaded themselves. Again, you can think up all the stretch goals you want, you can plan the exact amount of time you think it's going to take, but you have no idea what that's going to be until you actually sit down and develop it. In traditional game development with a publisher developer model, we don't hear about this stuff. We'll get announcements about the games being worked on. We may get an interview, some teaser footage, but that's it. If a game gets delayed, we'll get the announcement. But when it comes to the transparency of the Kickstarter or crowdfunding and indie space, we're kind of in the trenches with the developers watching all this unfold. Sometimes it's a grand masterpiece of design working together, and other times it is a spectacular, catastrophic failure, as we have seen with indie games and early access titles that just crash and burn. Another big example of this kind of difficulty when it comes to designing and building a game would be from one of my favorite developers, Arkin Games. Last year, and over the last 2 years, they were working on the game Stars Beyond Reach, which was going to be their next grand experiment. It was going to be a 4X grand strategy city builder with, of course, procedurally generated elements, randomized content, and all that great stuff. And they ran into a problem. They just could not get all the game mechanics and systems in sync with each other. And there is certainly a greater talk for designing 4X or grand strategy games, but we started that. We'll be here until probably an hour or so. But when it came to Stars Beyond Reach, in postmortems and developer logs, Chris Park talked about how they were running into trouble with just trying to figure this game out. Again, you can come up with the most brilliant idea in your head, but it doesn't matter when you start putting it into code and seeing how things will work in actuality. I could sit here and just spend the next 40 minutes or so talking about some of my dream ideas. And trust me, I've thought of all the mechanics and all the systems. Now, all you have to do is ask me how someone's going to program that, and that's kind of the challenge. But with Stars Beyond Reach, they talked about how they kept coming up with different builds, different ideas for its systems and mechanics, which of course every new system means it pushes back development. And when development gets pushed back, it means more money. And when you get more money, it causes trouble, and you can always just see this, sliding slope of disaster happening with some of these titles. And what ended up happening was they just could not settle on the design and then program it. As we said a few minutes ago, every new system, every new redesign means more coding. And what happens in some cases is these two factors, the design and the programming, may not be able to come together. You can figure out the perfect solution design-wise, but what happens if you can't program that or you can't code that into your engine? Or what if you have a master programmer who can, code in his sleep, but you can't settle on a design, or every design you come up with just doesn't work? When it comes to game development like this, it's like trying to design, it's like building a house when you are not only the guy who's designed the blueprint, but you're also going to construct the house, and you're also doing all the interior design all at the same time. And it just can be a overwhelming mess in some cases. And sadly, my big example and the final one for today's critical thought is from a game that I was really hoping and betting on being a success. And that was Clockwork Empires, the second game from Gaslamp Games. And this game, from the word go, I was excited about it. The development logs they put up over I want to say at least 3 years of development, painted a beautiful picture for game design. This was going to be a procedurally based Dwarf Fortress X Lovecraftian steampunk city builder with persistent elements across the world and multiplayer, and I mean, it was pretty much checking off every box of a game that I wanted. Oh, and it was also going to be in 3D. Keep that in the back of your minds for a minute there. And as with all games, it started out in terms of developer builds. We didn't see anything. I want to say it was put on early access in 2014, but I don't remember all those dates in my head. And the early version was rough. I mean, it was very rough. AI patterns were breaking. There were texture issues, crashes, and all that. The minimap didn't work, but this was to be expected. The game was in early access. And what was kind of the issues was, normally when you see a game in early access and you can chart the development of it from start to finish and so on, you see growth. You see things changing. And even at the earliest stages of a game in early access, a game that is going to work, you can tell just by how the design is meshing together and the game plan of the developers. I'll give you a counter example. I started playing Stonehearth again, Alpha 19, on the Twitch stream, and I'm generally impressed with what's there. Is the game done? No. But what's there is a very telling sign that the developers know what they're doing. They have a game plan. They know from A to B to C how this game is supposed to go. With Clockwork Empires, it never got to that point. And this is coming from someone who was a fan of it. Every few months, it seemed like they were redesigning a system or going back over previous systems. This wasn't like, building a tower where you have each layer coming together and then you move on to the next. This was like, we build 6 floors, and now we have to tear down 3 more and rebuild them again. We get a few more floors up. Oh, there's a problem. Let's re-tear it down and go again. And this was a telling sign of their early access. As a really big point, I want to say this was early to mid 2016, so at least 2 years in development, they finally announced that they had to pull multiplayer. And that's the thing, a lot of people didn't even realize they were working on a multiplayer mode. They were still trying to get the basic elements down. And all that time they spent building it, of course, or just coming up with the design, was scrapped. I need to take a quick sip of soda. My mouth just completely dried up. And all throughout the game's development, you could just tell that there were problems in terms of its initial foundation. Core systems such as the decoration system, or how people got happy from how buildings were, or the decorative items in a building, that was torn down and rebuilt. The farming systems were altered multiple times. Research was added late into the game's development cycle, and it still wasn't completely finished. And then developers just completely redid the UI, completely redid the base systems. They made some things easier, they made some things more micro-intensive. Oh, that reminds me. There was the whole kerfuffle of the logistics or the maintenance system that they added. This was late in 2016 when they added in the fact that all the buildings needed items to function. They were like these work chests. And the only way to get them was to build them in I think it was in the workshop. But this added in so much more micromanagement that wasn't even required. No one even asked for it. But this kind of leads into that problem. They were trying to design all these systems and running into problems and having to rebuild them. At the same time, they were trying to design and code the 3D engine. And so they may come with a really good idea, but they may run into problems with actually implementing in terms of code. As anyone who's a game designer will tell you, it is infinitely more difficult designing a 3D game compared to a 2D game. And when you throw in all these issues together, Clockwork Empires, no matter how much I wanted to hope and, cross my fingers it was going to work, it just did not come together. And again, it's just one of those things. It's just a sliding slope of problems that extenuate out or extrapolate out into more issues, which push the game back, which cause more issues, and then every redesign just starts that whole cycle again. And they just never managed to get more than like 2 or 3 steps ahead before they took like 4 or 5 steps back. And as a really good sign of this kind of issue, late in 2016, I think it was like September, I want to say the game was released in October, and this was like around August, September, things were finally coming together. We were starting to see progress, and a lot of people were going, okay, now let's see what's going to happen in early access. And that's when they announced the game was going to 1.0, just as it was getting close to being finished, or close to finally settling on that design. And we've talked about this before with this concept of harmonizing game design, or getting your core foundation or core gameplay loop set before you grow things out. And of course, as we've said over the course of this critical thought, when you're trying to code your game and build up on the programming side, it becomes a lot difficult to focus on the design. This is one kind of the advantages of having like those very large teams in the AAA space, because you have dedicated teams designed for building the game systems. You have a team of programmers. You have a team of artists. But when you're a small studio or an indie developer, and there may be only 4 or 5 of you, it becomes a lot harder when everyone is splitting this work. Very rarely will you see an indie team when you have just one person who focuses on design and that's it. They will not look at any of the art, they will not look at any of the programming, they are just strictly a game developer or the system designer. That's usually not the case. And let's wrap things up here before we get even more philosophical for today. To summarize, the challenges of creating a game come by the fact that you have to code it at the same time you're designing it. And these two elements are sometimes separate and can be almost impossible or very difficult to get them to work. And one of the biggest signs of early access or crowdfunding games in trouble is when developers have to just constantly rebuild their games due to either engine problems or bugs, or the fact that the design is just not working. And going back to what we talked about with stretch goals, one of the surefire ways to kill your game is to overload it with stretch goals that you haven't even considered what they're going to do to your game. You can sit here and say, oh, we hit these 5 stretch goals, we're going to add guaranteed 5 more hours of content, 3 more procedurally generated maps, and of course multiplayer and cross-platform porting. But while you're sitting there creating your Kickstarter, you can have a rough estimate to how long that will take, but what happens if it doesn't work? What do you do when your 6th Kickstarter goal simply is not meshing with your design? Do you cut that goal? Do you try and redesign your entire game to fit that goal? It's not an easy answer. And again, for every delay, for every redesign, for every engine issue you run into, it's going to push your game back. And as I guess the moral for today's story is, there is no game ever made that had a perfect game development. No one ever sat down and said, my game will include all of this, it will cost this amount of money, and we will have it done in 1 year, 6 months, 5 days, 30 minutes, and 10 seconds from now. If that ever happens, that will be one of those signs that we're either dealing with aliens or robots, or maybe this could be a signal of the end of the world. Who knows? But let's wrap things up for today. Thank you so much for watching the Critical Thought. As always, if you're enjoying things, be sure to like and subscribe. Check out our Patreon campaign for ways to help support and add more content for everyone to enjoy. And otherwise, be sure to check back daily for more great content here and on GameWisdom.com, where we examine the art and science of games. Until tomorrow, have a great night, and I'll see you all then. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoy it, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and of course share with your friends, it always helps out. For daily posts on all manner of game design and industry topics, check out game-wisdom.com. To support the site and everything that I do, be sure to check out the Patreon campaign. If we can hit goals, it will mean more content for everyone to enjoy, and I'll be able to support myself and my household. If you want to follow me, you can find me on Twitter at GWBycer for updates throughout the day and random thoughts from me. And lastly, you can find me on Twitch right over there at GWBycer for daily streams most nights around 10 Eastern. Thanks again for watching the video, and be sure to check out more great content coming to the Game Wisdom channel real soon.